Welcome back to another episode of When Death Awaits. This one is based out of East Los Angeles. It's got some eerie similarities with Scott Peterson, which is timely in this sense. Uncle Rich, why don't you set us up? I know there's a little bit of differences here with this case and the Scott Peterson case, but similar facts, and I'll let you take it away.
Sure, I appreciate it. Well, what's interesting right now, and first and foremost, is that this case that we're going to talk about today, as you mentioned, has some similarities to the Peterson case, to the extent that the LA Times contacted me in the midst of the Peterson case because they wanted to make some level of comparisons. And one of the things that I'm quoted in the LA Times is saying was that the only reason why my case didn't get the high profile that the Peterson case did was the fact that these folks were from an underserved community, lower income, and they weren't as financially successful. And I think those 3 points truly do reflect on how we look at this kind of a situation. But I think to a large extent, for me at least, any case that I delve into, regardless of what that person's station is, I'm always going to go at it with vigor, going at it with a lot of enthusiasm. And of course, I don't want to in any way take it personally, but I certainly want to, bring out my level of concern so that the family understands that I, in fact, have some level of deep interest in these cases. And the reason why I'm mentioning that is because at the conclusion of this case, truly, it reflects on my level of disappointment in many cases with regards to people I sometimes work with. And I'll delve into that as we go along. But I just wanted to touch on that just for a minute. But anyways, I get called out. It's about 9 o'clock at night on Leonard, right off of Whittier Boulevard. And as I drive to location, there is a scrimmage line of deputies, and they are, in fact, being shouted down by probably in excess of maybe 15, 20 people. Almost sort of like a riotous type situation. I'd never seen anything like that before. It's fascinating. I've come up on crime scenes, crime scene tape up, and so forth and so on. But I was told that the incident happened inside the house.
So it's a residential neighborhood.
Right. Primarily single-family homes. And I'm like, okay. So I drive up in my, what they refer to as a slick car or detective vehicle. So I drive up in my suit and tie, right, while these guys are all holding their batons, preventing anybody from, for whatever reason. I guess they wanted to go in the house. I don't know what they wanted. So I walk up and I look and I ask the first deputy, I said, secretly, I don't want to do it in any way, make an overt type action or want to make it a scene. I just said to him, whispered in his ear, why don't you put some crime scene tape up? And he's like, hey, not a bad idea. And we put some tape up because it was at a dead-end street, believe it or not. Put some tape up, and the crowd dissipated.
Wow.
It's like they were more inclined to, to adhere to a crime scene tape than they were to adhere to a scrimmage line of deputies.
They just never thought to do it sooner? No? Okay.
No. And I could cite a number of samples, but that's one of I found that interesting, So I see, for the purposes of this, I see crime scene tape up here, which is interesting because that's exactly what we used all the time. And anyways, so I get there and I walk in. I'm working with the gal that I never worked with. I knew her for years. Her and I graduated from the academy together. And we walk into the house and we were directed to one of the small bedrooms. A small home, probably no more than maybe 1,100, 1,200 square feet. But it did have a fireplace, interestingly enough, in the living room. So I walk up and we directed to a female who was covered in a blanket, and it was pretty much really horrific scene. I mean, that particular scene has been embedded in my mind for the rest of my life. You know, I've seen some pretty vicious type of attacks, but this one definitely took a toll on me, you know, visually. And I was also told that her boyfriend, the guy by the name of Roger Marquez, had evidently been taken to the station for the purposes of this investigation. And they had removed his attire. Again, I was not present during that time, but that's what I was told that happened. So we go into the home, and at that juncture, we're looking at, okay, what are we doing here? Why are we doing this? And what does this young man, Roger Marquez, have anything to do with this thing?
Before you jump into that, is it all right if I list off the scene of what damage had actually been done to the victim?
Sure.
From the court case?
Sure.
Yeah, so this is obviously from People versus Marquez. I think this is 2002, April 2002. The autopsy showed that the female here, her name was Noelle Chagolla, was stabbed 26 times. 8 of the wounds were deep enough to be classified as fatal. Those wounds were in her eye, neck, chest, and back. She also had defensive wounds on her hands and arms. Toxicology reports came back negative for alcohol and narcotics. She had engaged in sexual activity close to the time of death, but there was no evidence of forcible sexual assault.
Pretty much sums up that.
Yeah.
That's brutal.
Yeah. Well, you know, what's even more interesting is the fact that the sexual assault component, I actually brought out our coroner's investigators to do a sexual assault kit. I had requested that primarily because I wasn't ruling out the fact that during the course of this thing she may have been sexually assaulted, but not necessarily by Roger. It was just merely by this particular incident. So when they unrolled the quilted type blanket, then I saw what you've just described were a number of stab wounds about the body. In particular, and I don't want to go forward too quickly, but understand that the eyeball injuries were allegedly done by way of a watermelon cutter.
Oh my God.
And I'll go into specifics as to why that happened, but let's go back to this. So what I also noted, and it was probably an excess of like 7 people in a really small bedroom conducting their investigation. But what was particularly interesting was the fact that when I went into the living room, I noted that there were a number of clothing that were still smoldering in a fireplace. Mind you, this is a hot summer day, and it's actually in the evening in Los Angeles, so it's probably about 75, 80 degrees still, but during the day that day, it went up to 102 degrees. So we had...
Yeah, that's going to raise suspicions.
Yeah, absolutely. When you see, smoke billowing from a fireplace at 102 degrees, you would probably have some level of suspicion.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But...
And I think from the report showed that neighbors obviously had noticed that, and they're like, I think there were a few neighbors that had knocked and checked in to see if everything was okay, but there was no response.
Exactly. So at that juncture, what we did was we ended up, we probably were at the crime scene from about 9 at night until around, I would say, 5, 6 in the morning, maybe 7. It was a long, arduous crime scene. We didn't want to miss anything. I didn't necessarily want to miss anything because my position has always been that if I'm working with somebody, I want to make sure that any and all responsibility falls on my shoulder, because over the years, I've learned that you can't rely on anybody. I mean, whether it's law enforcement or any other kind of job, you want to make sure that you do the job that you were responsible for it, so that you can basically justify everything you've done. And that's exactly what I did here. So now it's time to go talk to the old Roger Marquez, who's sitting there with a jailhouse jumpsuit, which you see here. We actually have him holding up a sign with his name on it.
Yeah, and he's 22 years old. girlfriend, who is the victim, she's, I think, 21. Pretty young couple. I think she has a 6-year-old daughter from a previous relationship. And then we find out in this one that she was pregnant with Roger's kid.
Which becomes another dynamic of this particular experience.
Right. Now, you didn't know this when you had begun the investigation.
No, and nor did the coroner investigators it wasn't until we did the autopsy. And I always make it a point anytime you have a female, and it's probably one of the most gruesome parts of attending autopsies is when they have to open up and check the ovarian area to see if there's a fetus in there. And I've always made a point. To the extent I took a couple of detectives one time on not this one, but literally the detective who wasn't a homicide investigator, but he was part of the investigation. He literally fainted on the coroner's floor. You don't want to faint on the coroner's floor.
Yeah.
And I digress.
Brutal.
Nonetheless.
And just to also set the scene a little bit more, this was Roger lived at. This is him and his girlfriend were living at home with his mother.
With Roger's mother, yes.
Yeah, and Roger and Noelle lived in a unit above the garage. I think in the back.
It was, as I understood, that bedroom in the front there.
In the front, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's where they found her body.
Okay.
Yeah. What was interesting, and you bring up a good point, was the fact that the mother was not home, and nor was that 6-year-old child. But what precipitated the anger of that crowd was the mother and all the family that were there wanted to go into that home was because the mother, Noelle, she had complained to the East LA Sheriff's Department that her daughter was being held against her will. So she actually went to the station, and then the deputies actually went over and they talked to her personally, and she denied it, that she was living there voluntarily, very happy, and that, she was moving on with her life. And so she had literally removed herself from potentially having any problems. Well, at least the deputies having any liability, because later on, it's interesting because East LA got a hold of me, aside from the investigation, and said, hey, we learned that she had filed a complaint and we didn't do anything about it. I said, well, I'm not going to defend the deputies who went over there, but the reality was that she was, in fact, voluntarily there, not only by way of the deputy statements, but by way of the mother of Roger. Roger says that, Noelle was perfectly fine at the house. So, and the mother, an amazingly nice woman. Roger's mother, she was amazingly cooperative, amazingly nice. And but let's talk about Roger's interview. He, needless to say, denied it. He said his alibi.
Well, he's the one who called in that he had found her dead, right?
Right. That's exactly right. What basically happened was he alleged that he was at Target, and that when he returned home, he found Noelle in the closet and wrapped up in a blanket. And I find that hard to believe because, how did he know she was in there in the blanket, Because when we found her, she was literally in the blanket. So we didn't know.
So you couldn't see her.
Right, exactly.
Oh.
So that became, and then of course, he said he called 911, and then we later learned, that was the most interesting aspect to this case. We later learned that Roger pretty much all his adolescence was incarcerated in the California Youth Authority. So he never had the opportunity to learn how to drive. And at one point he wanted to get rid of the body, so he had called one of his buddies. Said, hey man, you need to help me take this, gal out of the house. And his friend, who we later learned only a couple of months after this thing, came up to us, approached us, and told us about it. But the reality was that he was like, I'm not going to help you. So
you were suspicious off the bat that Roger is the guy you need to look at.
100%.
Even though he's the one who called, and now this is where it comes to like Scott Peterson, right?
Right.
Because it's a suspect who's calling to report the murder,
right,
or the death,
right, and
alleging that they're innocent.
Right. He actually went to the extent of dry crying, you know. He's on the phone and he's pretending like he's, you know, distraught.
Yeah.
You know, and the reality was when we talked to him, you can see this photo here, that's pretty much the way he was the entire time. And understand that he had a really bad methamphetamine addiction at the time. So, and that said, so we talked to him and basically he establishes the alibi. I'm looking at this from, okay, this is all circumstantial, meaning we could connect certain things with him, and lo and behold, I learned that of the clothing being burned that night, that means that whatever blood was on him, he had taken off, you know, and thrown into the fireplace. So everything was starting to focus on him. And one of the things that I've always done in my investigations, for anybody that's prospective detective, if you will, I would just say this: you always want to start from the inside and then work your way out. You don't work your way out and come back in. You start from inward and then you work your way out. That's just always been my case, always been the case. And Umar, you brought up a case where somebody was detained for 17 hours, or something like that. I was like, you know, you're not going to be in an interview for 17 hours. It's just not going to happen. But keep in mind, you can lie to a suspect. You have no qualms about it, but you cannot.
You're talking about to like elicit a
confession, right?
Confession, yeah.
Right. You cannot. You can lie to them, but you cannot invoke religion. You cannot. If they tell you they want an attorney, your conversation stops right then and there. I mean, that's just it. If they say they don't want to talk to you, stop conversation, because you've now crossed the threshold of violating their constitutional right.
Did Roger ask for an attorney?
Nope.
Oh, he didn't. Okay.
He did not. He did not. He was not familiar with the processes. But it didn't matter. I mean, what am I saying? No, you're lying, Roger. We know you did it. I mean, it's not going to really matter at that juncture. Yeah. You know, at least in my estimation, having conducted thousands and thousands of interviews, you know, you just play it by ear, and you hope for the best in terms of what you could get from them. I mean, I've had guys, I've given a cup of coffees to guys, and they eventually come across and say, okay, I'll tell you what happened. You know, I bought a guy a pack of cigarettes one time, and he literally confessed to the entire thing. You know, I bought it. I'll just leave it at that. Excuse me. Anyways, that said, so I interview. Now it's 8 o'clock in the morning. I'm still trying to formulate my plan here, but at least I got all these circumstantial evidence that puts basically the arrows toward this young man. And I'm sitting outside. The configuration of East LA Sheriff Station is that there's a parking lot, and then you walk out the back door or you walk into that back door, take somebody into custody. But I see that my partner is walking Roger out the back door uncuffed. I'm like, what the heck's going on here? And I was like, wow.
Now, is this your regular partner, or who is this person?
She was just designated to work with me that night.
That night. So
yeah, I never worked with her before.
You had your regular partner who was day off. Probably.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what did you have any rapport with her before, or did you have any sort of sense of what she was like?
Oh yeah, definitely. I knew there was some level of I don't want to be too crude here, but I knew that there was a level of laziness there. That, you know, I'm not sure what her objective was, but keep in mind, she had been there a few more years than me when this went down. So I was she's the alleged, lead officer, lead investigator, but I don't play that, you know.
Seniority means nothing to you.
Nothing, absolutely nothing. I've taught thousands of cadets, and I've always said, you know, seniority should be respected, but should not be followed if they do something wrong, you know, and that's always been my mantra. But that aside, she's driving him home, and it's ironic because I'm on the phone with the DA saying, hey, I got this case, and I'm calling our domestic violence DA's office because they handle, and it's called victim impact, and I said, this is the case. DAs never commit themselves, and ultimately bring the case in. Let me look at it. So now I got 72 hours. I can hold it for 72 hours, my God. So I'm like, wait a minute. But they just took the guy home.
Uncuffed.
So I'm like, this ain't happening. you know? So I take a couple of deputies with me, patrol deputies, and after this, about 10 minutes after, I'm driving down the street, which is not too far from the station, and there's old Roger bringing the trash cans in like it's just another day. What's going on? Anyways, I'm like, okay, hey, Roger, you got to come with us. And understand that Roger had connections to Mexico. And that's one of my biggest fears, because I've had a number of defendants that have ran off to Mexico, and unfortunately sometimes we never find them or never see them, and the extradition process is amazingly difficult, unbelievably difficult. So I said to myself, well, I'm not going to hesitate to put this guy in, because potentially he could run off and potentially even do it again to somebody else. A good looking guy, you know? Anyways, wow. So I throw him in the back seat, take him to station, book him, and I take it over to the DA's office. They go, we're going to file it. And as they're doing that, I get a phone call from my partner. She goes, hey, I understand you arrested the guy. I said, yeah, I did. Just leave whatever you have on my desk. You can never touch this case again. Jeez. You know, come on, man. You know, yeah. And it just frustrates. And I've seen it time and again, guys. You know, I talk about PTSD regarding all the what I've seen. When you work with people like that, that's PTSD too, you know?
I mean, it's also, these are the people we've entrusted you guys to serve in justice law and protect the streets. And, you know, you're always going to find bad apples everywhere. But you find lazy apples, you find, she was going to let a guy who, you know, allegedly committed a heinous crime, a lot of evidence pointing his way, ties to Mexico, who could flee, just drove him back home.
Yeah, and it's interesting because his father, and his methamphetamine binge, his father was apparently some wealthy doctor down in Mexico worth millions. And he alleged to have killed her because he felt that she was trying to take his inheritance away.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, there's later on, obviously, further investigation and going into trial, you learn a lot that he was not a happy camper with her. He found her 6-year-old daughter to be called her bratty. Multiple friends of his and acquaintances and people he had done community service with. As you mentioned, he was coming out of the correction facility, so he used to do community service. He would make comments such as, I'm going to do something to like her. She's, you know, he would accuse her of being unhappy or of him not being happy with her. He was worried about possibly having to pay child support for his own child. He's already talking about child support. He's just dating this woman. And apparently he had cheated on her multiple times. She had forgiven him. And her cousin had said that she had told him that he had hit her. So there's a whole list of, you know, problematic behavior in this relationship, and a lot of, I'm sure, evidence that pointed towards his motives for committing this act.
Going back to the citing that cheating thing, on one occasion he's so methed out, so tweaked, that he holds Noelle and his friend Brian in a home and does not allow them to leave and accuses them of cheating on him.
Wow. Jeez.
I mean, could you imagine? I mean, just think about that. But anyways, so I end up, this case, interestingly enough, took about 4 years to actually get into court. And one of the concerns, because we learned at the autopsy that, in fact, Noelle was pregnant. I think she was 3 or 4 months pregnant. And so the defense, because we had on double murder, the DA filed double murder charges on him. The Supreme Court took this on to assess whether or not the child, or this unborn child, was in fact a viable fetus or not, meaning it would live, you know, so forth. And I don't know the scientific aspects of this, but they ruled that in fact it was not viable, and as a result, he just was confronted with the single murder.
Yeah, that's a whole nother discussion too, because I think under California state law and the penal code, double murder is on the table. If you're killing someone who is pregnant, you can be charged for double murder.
Right.
Obviously, 4 months pregnant is pretty far along. And for whatever reason, I'm not the legal expert here, and I didn't read too much into why that charge was dropped, but that could be an interesting follow-up, or if there is someone, a fan who's interested, drop it in the comments. We can talk about it next time, but he was not charged with that double murder, just fell to the single charge, and that's what the California Supreme Court decided.
Which ultimately we ended up with initially. Well, let me just go back one just second. So now he's in custody. We went to the California Supreme Court decision, and now we're about to go to trial. And again, I am inundated with cases. And cases that I've solved, cases that I'm going to court for. And my partner who was there with me that night, she calls me. She goes, "Hey, do you mind if I sit in as the investigating officer on this case?"
Talk about a group project, someone showing up at the end to take credit. We've all been there.
Exactly. I was like, really? You're kidding me, right? And you know what I did? Because who I am, you go ahead. It didn't really matter to me at this point. We got the guy in pocket. He is, in fact, going to have to deal with the consequences of this. Evidence is overwhelming. Yeah, I have no qualms about that. But the fact that she would go over there and, present herself in such a way that, yeah, I'm the one. And she went to the extent of apologizing to me. Literally. Apologizing to me. For what?
This guy could have been scot-free and fled the country.
100%.
That's insane that you were there that morning to see this, because if you didn't, he could have gone in a matter of, minutes, hours back home.
Exactly. Oh, yeah. It just unbelievably overwhelmed me in terms of what he should have done was got out of that car, got out of her car and ran from the house. That's what I would have done, but instead he went, I guess he was, one of his responsibilities bringing those trash cans in.
From those experiences, do you have an approach or a mindset, or what do you teach junior officers who, it's with communication with a partner or teamwork style, how to approach it, and of course you're going to get bad apples, but like how do you step up?
Well, my argument has always been that I didn't hire this person. So if they ultimately end up lazy, listless, useless, and do not want to do the job, hey, that's not me. I will instill in them a certain level of a work ethic, but it's entirely up to them in terms of whether or not they want to go ahead and be productive. Because nobody's going to be patting you on the back. This, to me, in the terms of law enforcement experience at least, it's about what you want to do for the community and how you want to be able to sleep at night, not knowing that, something is going to, transpire from this. And I'll just give you one little sad note. Speaking of Roger's mother, I mean, she was just devastated when I informed her that that Noelle was in fact pregnant and had been killed in the process.
Yeah, really.
Her grandchild.
Yeah, I feel for her because it's also in the reading from the report. This is Roger's mother, who they live with, who obviously extending the home. She apparently was very good with Noelle's 6-year-old daughter. They'd sleep in the same room, taking care of her. And clearly, she was very cooperative too, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is her own son, probably realizing some of the faults of her own son, but seeing how this is all ended up really tragic.
Mm-hmm.
And for the daughter too.
Yeah, I agree. And going to a full circle here, guys, and that is that when I look at the Scott Peterson case in terms of the efforts that he made to try and find the culprit, which of course was a complete farce, complete fabrication, to ultimately him getting convicted and going and suffering, the ultimate sentencing, which was the death penalty. He has since then rescinded that. But in this case, so when we look at Scott Peterson, in this case, Roger Marquez was sentenced to 25 years to life. The most interesting aspect to it, he was not one of these notorious gang members. So he was sent down south to a prison down by in San Diego, and he overdosed on methamphetamine and died 6 months after being in prison.
Oh,
Yeah.
man.
So
The one last question that I think, we draw on the parallels with Scott Peterson, but in your experience, what is going through the mind of the suspects here, confirmed killer in the Roger Marquez case, who call in their own murder thinking they're going to get away with it?
yeah, you know what? And I've seen it on a number of occasions. A lot of times people just resign themselves to saying, now that they've done it, how do I clean it up? And if they could do it without any kind of connection, they would. Because if you're in fact capable of crossing that threshold and taking somebody's life, you're going to be able to do it again and again and again. And this is why there's so much, for me at least, stopping somebody from doing it prevents somebody else from it happening too. So in that regards, it's not a matter of, okay, oh my God, what did I do wrong? No, it's, oh my God, I'm going to get caught. Let me see what I could do to prevent myself from sitting in a cell, being around a bunch of hairy men for the rest of my life.
Crazy.
And that, to me, I mean, I've told guys, hey, we're arresting you. They'll throw up, and so, no, I don't see that as a method by which they're feeling in any way guilty. They're just feeling an effort to try and avoid getting caught.
So they're just thinking they're pulling a fast one.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Uncle Rich, this is the start of another new segment called Have You Heard?
It's the notorious convicted wife killer Scott Peterson. He showed up in court via Zoom for a dramatic hearing that his family hopes could eventually clear his name. Now 51, Peterson has aged from the 30-year-old he was when the case first exploded into the headlines in 2003. Peterson is serving a life sentence for murdering his wife Lacey and their unborn child. Their remains washed ashore in San Francisco Bay 4 months after Lacey disappeared.
Now Peterson's case is being taken up by the Los Angeles Innocence Project, which seeks to exonerate wrongfully convicted prisoners.
They want DNA tests on a bloody mattress found in a burned-out van near the Petersons' home at the time of Lacey's disappearance. They say the tests could provide new evidence that someone else killed Lacey.
All right. So another infamous case. Uncle Rich, we'd love your thoughts.
Yeah, sure. First and foremost, he's lost all of his appellate reviews. So that goes to show you that there's been a number of judges that have looked at all these transcripts, looked at all the evidence, and clearly have said that this guy is guilty of the death of his wife and unborn child. That's one thing. Two, have you ever heard of the Innocence Project before this?
I have, but would love to hear your thoughts.
Well, the Innocence Project, I believe, is a justifiable organization for the purposes of trying to exonerate individuals who may have been wrongly convicted. However, in this case, I think their efforts are just to try and raise the profile of their organization. And I'm probably going to get some bad press on this, but I'm just letting you know that I appreciate the Innocence Project, no doubt about it. I don't even want to go into why, but I'll just say I do. Yeah. I just say, though, that in this case, with all of the appellate reviews, that they in fact have are barking up the wrong tree. But I will just say this much: just within this last week, they did in fact have made a decision. The court did make a decision on at least reviewing one segment of that DNA to make a determination as to whether or not it's something that they could in fact pursue. Other than that, everything else seems to be pretty much superfluous in terms of their efforts and energy.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Our legal system does open the door when there is new evidence and that's I don't know the standard of what that evidence needs to meet to reopen or relitigate. Mm-hmm. As you said, all the appellate process was exhausted for Scott Peterson.
Right.
I'm curious who came forward with this information, How was this discovered? How come it happened just now? Like, there's so many questions. Of course, if he's innocent, and the Innocence Project's aim and goal is what their name stands for, and I think they would be doing themselves a disservice if there was like new evidence and it wasn't brought forth. But from what it sounds from the News Inside Edition footage is that he thinks the chances are extremely slim unless, like you said, that DNA is present. So
exactly,
it'll be curious to see where that yields.
Yeah, and again, I didn't follow his trial from start to finish, but I will just say this: that particular evidence could have been already. Maybe they made an attempt to introduce it back then, and the judge had overturned it and decided not to. So. Again, I don't know whether that was the case, but nonetheless, the fact that Peterson and the Innocence Projects are making some kind of, futile effort to get him off, kudos to them. But I tell you right now, anybody who didn't know of the existence of the Innocence Projects, they do now, because this is probably one of the most renowned cases in the United States by way of him killing his wife and unborn child. And, him having that extramarital affair and so forth and so on. And then him going on a media frenzy. Where's my wife? I think she ran off with somebody else. Whatever the case is. I mean, Lacey's mom was just devastated by this whole thing. I'm sure she's devastated at the fact that that this is even being talked about right now in terms of family impact and so forth and so on. So
I'd love to, in a future episode, get your thoughts, or maybe we explore an example of some of the successes of the Innocence Project.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Maybe if someone's listening, we can bring somebody on. That would be really cool.
Yeah, and it's interesting because the Innocence Project doesn't necessarily just address evidentiary issues. It addresses constitutional issues as well, violation of somebody's constitutional rights, and how they could formulate a plan to attack the investigation of the DA's office by way of not having provided those rights to those particular defendants. So
fascinating. We'll be tracking this one.
Well, I think that's it for episode 2.
Thank you. Subscribe, like, comment,
and definitely follow along in the socials too. A lot more behind the scenes. Check out our new merch, which we'll be having available. And thank you for following along. We look forward to next week.
Have a great day.
Have a great day.
We need a better sign.
We need a branded sign off.